April 18, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing into its final chaos. Allied bombers thundered over ruined cities. Columns of refugees choked the roads of Germany. And the Reich, that had once promised 1,000 years of power, now stood on its knees. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Massachusetts, a line of military trucks rumbled through the gates of Fort Devens. Behind canvas flaps sat a group of captives seldom remembered in the pages of history, German women prisoners of war. They were not combat troops, but auxiliaries. Nurses pulled from makeshift field hospitals, Red Cross volunteers taken alongside their units, clerks from military offices captured in surrendering towns, even young women who had followed the Wehrmacht across Europe, offering services as translators, typists, or helpers. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their faces pale from long transport across the ocean under the authority of the War Shipping Administration. What bound them together was not combat, but captivity. Propaganda had prepared them for this moment. For years, the German press and radio had painted America as a land of barbarians. Leaflets had warned women that surrender meant dishonor. SS training manuals spoke of starvation, humiliation, and even torture in Allied hands. Whispers in the barracks said worse, that captured women would never be seen again. Now, as the truck stopped and the gates closed behind them, those stories clung to every step they took. The convoy halted before long rows of wooden barracks. The air smelled of damp pine and coal smoke. Guards in olive-drab uniforms gave brisk orders. The women hesitated, expecting blows, perhaps jeers. Instead, they were directed into a processing hall. Their names were recorded, possessions cataloged, and medical inspection ordered. Then came the command that froze them in place. Showers. Line up. In silence, they removed their boots and were handed thin towels. For many, the word carried a sinister echo. Rumors from the East had spoken of showers that were not showers at all. As they filed into the barracks, steam drifted from the tiled rooms, and a corporal distributed small square bars. The smell was sharp, clean, unfamiliar after weeks aboard crowded ships. One woman turned to another, her voice trembling. Is this the poison they told us of? Hands shook as soap passed from palm to palm. For a heartbeat, fear held the room still. Then the first stream of water hissed from the pipes, warm and ordinary. The women stood motionless, then slowly lifted the soap to their skin. Relief mixed with shame. The enemy had not humiliated them. He had washed them. The paradox began here, in the tiled silence of Fort Devens. Prisoners who expected brutality were met with hygiene and order. Nurses who attended to the wounded in muddy field stations now found themselves inspected for lice under the Geneva Convention's medical protocols. Clerks who had worked in dusty offices were issued fresh bedding. The first act of their captivity was not degradation, but cleanliness. For some, this small mercy was unsettling. A diary later recovered described the moment. We thought it would be our death. Instead, they gave us soap. I cannot decide if this is kindness or mockery. Outside, the camp stretched wide, rows of barracks behind barbed wire, watchtowers rising at the corners. The Red Cross would inspect it regularly, and its order was deliberate. Yet for the women, that first night was filled with whispers. Why feed us? Why spare us? What do they want? The contradictions would not end with the showers. They had stepped into a prison that in some ways offered more food, more safety, even more dignity than their homeland at war. But on that April day, they could not yet know what captivity would mean. The cliffhanger remained in their minds as the lights dimmed in the barracks and the gates of Fort Devens locked behind them. If captivity began with soap, what would tomorrow bring? The silence inside the Fort Devens barracks carried weight. Even after the showers, after the unexpected bars of soap, the women spoke in hushed tones, as though every gesture of order might conceal a trap. To understand that suspicion, one must step back into the world they had left behind, into the echo chamber of Nazi propaganda that had shaped their every thought. For years, German citizens had lived under a torrent of carefully engineered fear. Newspapers like Focus Your B.O. Baxter and radio voices, such as Joseph Goebbels himself, repeated the message relentlessly. The Allies were not liberators, but destroyers. The British were portrayed as merciless imperialists. the Soviets as subhuman beasts, and the Americans as a mongrel nation of corruption. Women were warned most explicitly. Pamphlets and SS training manuals drilled the idea that to be captured was to be dishonored, stripped of identity, subjected to abuse, erased as both German and woman. In classrooms, in youth groups, even in church sermons twisted by propaganda, the warnings echoed. A nurse captured at a field hospital later recalled, "We were told that captivity would be worse than death, that if we surrendered, we would cease to exist as Germans." These fears were not abstract. They were part of the national bloodstream. By the time the women stepped onto American soil, dread had hardened into expectation. And yet, what they found inside the wire was something altogether different. The camp was not a den of humiliation, but a regimented institution operating under international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners, and the U.S. Army adhered to these guidelines with bureaucratic precision. Inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross were scheduled regularly, ensuring that conditions met international standards. Guards were briefed on protocols that forbade abuse, and medical officers conducted examinations not to demean, but to assess health after long transport. The contrast could not have been sharper. Instead of chaos, there were neatly arranged bunks. Instead of starvation, rations were distributed at fixed times. Bread, beans, coffee, sometimes even meat. Order replaced fear, yet order itself was strange, almost disorienting. For women accustomed to bombed-out homes, to scarcity in German cities where Allied air raids had reduced bakeries to rubble, the sight of stacked food supplies behind barbed wire was surreal. At night, some whispered doubts. "It must be a trick," one said, eyes fixed on a wooden shelf where soap still sat unused. Another muttered, "They want us alive, but for what purpose?" Suspicion clung because the propaganda had not simply painted enemies as cruel. It had defined cruelty as inevitable. To accept a full plate of food or the quiet courtesy of a U.S. Army medic was to betray everything they had been taught. A diary entry written weeks later captured a paradox. The enemy follows rules. They treat us as if we are soldiers, not women to be shamed. It is unbearable to admit, but their cruelty was a lie. And yet, I fear that believing in this kindness will undo me. The U.S. Army's War Department had made deliberate choices in this regard. Officers understood that the treatment of German prisoners, including women, would be scrutinized by neutral observers and could affect the safety of American captives held in Europe. Rigid discipline in the camps was therefore not only moral but strategic. In Fort Devens, this policy meant that women who expected to be stripped of dignity were instead recorded by clerks, measured for uniforms, and placed into a system that valued efficiency over humiliation. Still, the psychological war raged within. Every shower, every orderly roll call, every carefully portioned ration carried double meaning. To some, it was evidence that America's cruelty had been exaggerated. To others, it was proof of a more insidious manipulation, kindness as a weapon. Thus, the central paradox of captivity emerged. Behind barbed wire stood prisoners who had lost their freedom, yet found themselves treated with a level of dignity absent in their homeland's final collapse. They were caught between two worlds: the terrifying image of America forged in propaganda and the strange, structured reality of life under the Geneva Convention. The stage was set for the deeper conflict to come, not of guards against prisoners, but belief against experience. Morning began with the sharp blast of a whistle. At Fort Devens, like every American-run POW camp, the rhythm of the day was precise. German women, nurses once stationed in field hospitals, clerks from military offices, and volunteers who would follow Wehrmacht columns, lined up in rows as guards counted them one by one. Roll call was brisk, routine, and repeated until the numbers matched the records. Only then did the day truly begin. After assembly, duties were assigned. Some worked in the laundry, steam rising from wooden tubs as uniforms were scrubbed and hung on lines within the barbed wire perimeter. Others staffed the camp kitchens, their hands red from peeling endless sacks of potatoes. A few tended the gardens that dotted the compound, where neat rows of vegetables supplied the mess hall. The work was not grueling compared to wartime labor back home, but its monotony weighed heavily. Meals were the moment that unsettled many prisoners most. At long wooden tables, women were served bread, beans, and coffee, staples of the American ration system. Occasionally, meat appeared, something rare in Germany, where civilians survived on meager portions of cabbage, ersatz coffee, and thin slices of bread stretched with sawdust fillers. A nurse captured in the roar recalled in her diary, "I cannot believe this. Here, in the hands of the enemy, I eat more than I did in my own home." The shock was sharpened by contrast. By spring 1945, German cities were shattered. Food distribution was collapsing, and starvation haunted both civilians and soldiers. Behind the wire, abundance became a paradox. Women who had been taught to expect cruelty now faced the guilt of eating better in captivity than their families did in Cologne, Dresden, or Hamburg. The clink of tin cups and the smell of warm bread brought both comfort and shame. Red Cross parcels added another layer to the contradiction. Every so often, boxes arrived containing canned milk, dried fruit, cigarettes, and chocolate. Chocolate especially became a symbol of dissonance. Some women accepted it with quiet gratitude, savoring the sweetness they had not tasted in years. Others refused, fearing that to enjoy such luxuries was to betray their homeland. One woman whispered to a fellow nurse, "If our people could see this, they would curse us." Soap, bread, and chocolate emerged as the camp's unspoken motifs, ordinary objects transformed into symbols of paradox. Soap, once feared as poison in the showers, became part of a daily ritual of cleanliness enforced by the Americans. Bread, stacked in neat loaves, embodied both nourishment and dependence. Chocolate, wrapped in foreign paper, carried the taste of survival mixed with guilt. Life behind the wire was not one of comfort, but of contradiction. The women were still prisoners, watched constantly by guards from wooden towers, their movements confined to the fence compound. Letters were censored, freedoms curtailed, and futures uncertain. Yet the predictability of routine offered a strange kind of safety. No bombs fell here. No sirens wailed in the night. No Gestapo knocked at the door. Evenings brought moments of uneasy reflection. Some wrote diary entries by the dim light of barracks lamps. One recorded, "We are not free, but we are alive. And here, strangely, we are fed. I do not know how to feel." Others hummed old German songs softly after lights out, clinging to fragments of identity in the silence of captivity. The American guards maintained distance but were not hostile. Orders were shouted in English, often incomprehensible to women, but gestures filled the gap. When one prisoner struggled with the weight of a laundry sack, a guard wordlessly took part of the load and set it down for her. Small moments like these disturbed the rigid image of the enemy imprinted by propaganda. Yet suspicion never vanished. Around the bread table or in the laundry, whispers continued. Why are they doing this? What do they want? The fear lingered that kindness was only a mask, a tool for some deeper humiliation yet to come. Daily life in captivity thus became a battlefield of the mind. Every loaf of bread, every square of chocolate, every bar of soap confronted the women with a question. Was survival itself betrayal, or was it proof of resilience? As weeks turned into months, the paradox grew sharper. The camp provided not only food and order, but also a mirror, one that forced the women to see that their greatest struggle was no longer against the guards, but against themselves. And it was this quiet, internal war that would shape their captivity far more deeply than any barbed wire. The barbed wire fences at Fort Devens held the women physically, but their greatest struggle was waged within. For German women prisoners, nurses, clerks, Red Cross volunteers, and factory aides, captivity became less about survival of the body and more about survival of the mind. Every day confronted them with a paradox. The enemy they had been told to fear now gave them food, soap, and order. The Reich's propaganda had warned of brutality, dishonor, and ruin. Instead, the Americans followed the Geneva Convention, offered medical checks, and maintained discipline without cruelty. For some women, this discrepancy softened their hatred. Watching guards joke with one another, pass cigarettes between shifts, or quietly whistle familiar tunes, they saw not monsters but ordinary men, sons, brothers, perhaps fathers themselves. That human recognition unsettled the walls built by years of indoctrination. Others responded differently. To them, every act of kindness was manipulation, every gesture a weapon designed to strip them of loyalty. An extra slice of bread at dinner, a cigarette passed discreetly into a hand, even a smile. All were interpreted as ways to erode German resolve. Diaries captured this torment. One nurse recorded bitterly, "To be clean is to forget who we are. Each time I wash with their soap, I feel less German, more theirs." Soap, once feared as poison on the first day of captivity, had become woven into their daily routine. Yet in the lather and rinse, many sensed a deeper unease. The creeping thought that they were being drawn into the enemy's order, one bar at a time. At night, resistance surfaced in whispers. After lights out, faint voices carried across the barracks. Fragments of imperial songs sung under breath. Fragments of loyalty carried like embers. These quiet choruses were more than nostalgia. They were defiance, an assertion of identity against the erosion of certainty. But even defiance was fragile. Some nights the songs died quickly, smothered not by guards but by exhaustion, or by the quiet shame that came with full stomachs and clean hands. A secretary captured in Belgium later recalled, "It was easier to sing when hungry, harder when fed." The American guards remained distant yet present. Their watchfulness was strict, but their humanity slipped through in moments the women could not ignore. A soldier crouched to tie his bootlace, a man writing a letter on a crate during his break, another laughing softly at a joke his comrade whispered. These glimpses pierced the propaganda image of the barbaric enemy and planted a corrosive question. If the Americans were human, what did that make their captives believe back home? The psychological war was not uniform. Within the barracks, tensions rose between prisoners themselves. Some accepted small comforts, writing quietly in diaries, nibbling at chocolate when it arrived in Red Cross parcels. Others spat at such behavior, accusing them of weakness. One whispered confrontation recorded by a fellow prisoner lingered in memory. "Better alive here than dead in rubble," said one woman. "Better dead than cleansed with their soap," the other replied. Survival and ideology clashed within the same wooden walls. The International Red Cross inspections, with their measured reports of compliance and order, could not record this invisible battle. It was fought in the silence after meals, in the hesitation before unwrapping a piece of chocolate, in the shame that followed a good night's sleep under enemy blankets. Captivity eroded more than freedom. It eroded certainty in propaganda, in loyalty, in identity itself. Each day chipped away at the simplicity of hate, leaving behind confusion, contradiction, and quiet guilt. And in that silence, another rumor began to circulate. The war was drawing to a close. Repatriation might be possible, yet the thought of release stirred not only hope but dread. To return home would mean facing a homeland starved, bombed, and broken, and explaining how one had survived captivity in comfort. The women's hardest battle was no longer against their guards, but against themselves. And as whispers of release spread, the question loomed larger: what would survival truly cost? By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Yet for the German women behind the wire in Fort Devens, captivity stretched on in a peculiar limbo. The guns had fallen silent across Europe, but inside the barracks another struggle continued, not between prisoners and guards, but among the women themselves. Routines had settled into predictability. Morning roll calls, work assignments, meals measured with military precision. Some women leaned into this structure, gaining weight after years of wartime hunger, even finding comfort in the rhythm of camp life. For them, captivity provided something their homeland could no longer offer: stability, food, and the chance to survive another day without bombs overhead. They adapted, writing diary entries that expressed relief at finally being safe, if not free. But others refused to bend. Resistance surfaced in gestures so small they might have been invisible to outside eyes. Bread rolls discarded into latrines, beans left untouched, soap tucked away but never used, tokens of defiance against the notion of dependence. Some women refused to speak English, even when it could have made their lives easier. Instead, they whispered in German, humming imperial songs after lights out, guarding fragments of loyalty like embers against the dark. The Red Cross continued its inspections, Noting the women's fair treatment, balanced rations, and medical care, reports spoke of compliance with the Geneva Convention. On paper, these women were prisoners well cared for, but the reports could not capture the fractured lines running through the community, a quiet civil war of ideology. In one corner of the barracks, a nurse folded freshly washed linens and confided to her bunkmate, "Better alive here than dead there." She clung to survival as the truest act of resistance, enduring, outlasting the Reich's collapse, and perhaps one day rebuilding. Across the room, another voice cut back, colder, "Better dead than dishonored." For her, every swallowed bite of American bread was betrayal. Soap and bread, ordinary objects, became weapons in this war of meaning. To one woman, the smell of clean hands was a relief after years of scarcity and dirt. To another, it was shame, the sense of surrender. Diaries recorded these conflicting emotions, one prisoner writing, "We are nourished by the enemy. What will our brothers think, starving at home, if they knew we eat well in chains?" The tension did not always explode in open quarrels, but it simmered constantly. Silence at meals spoke louder than words. A roll of bread left untouched was a decoration. A clean, ironed uniform worn proudly was another. Each act, whether adaptation or defiance, carried weight. The American guards watched but rarely intervened. Their duty was discipline, not ideology. Inspections were strict, curfews enforced, but the women's inner battles went unseen. Still, a perceptive guard might have noticed the subtle ways the prisoners sorted themselves. Those who embraced camp order sat at the front during roll call. Those who resisted lingered at the back, eyes fixed coldly on the ground. This quiet conflict deepened as news filtered in of Germany's devastation. Letters arrived, some smuggled, some delivered through Red Cross channels, describing cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, hunger tightening its grip across the homeland. For those who had adapted, the news justified their choice. Survival here seemed rational, even merciful. For resistors, the news hardened resolve. How dare they live well while their people starved? And so the barracks became a mirror of the Reich's collapse. Ideology frayed, certainties dissolved, loyalties splintered. In captivity, these women waged their own war, not of weapons, but of meaning. Each loaf of bread, each bar of soap, each song hummed in the dark was a battle line drawn. The paradox of captivity grew sharper. To live meant to compromise. To resist meant to suffer. Neither choice was pure. Neither was easy. And as whispers of repatriation began to circulate, the question deepened. When the wire finally opened, which women would return home with pride, and which with shame. By the autumn of 1946, the barbed wire gates that had defined these women's world for more than a year began to swing open. Across the Atlantic, Europe was staggering back to its feet. Cities lay in rubble. Families were scattered, and hunger shadowed every street. It was in this context that the U.S. military, under the supervision of the International Red Cross, and according to the Geneva Convention, began large-scale repatriation programs. German women, nurses, clerks, Red Cross aides, even those who had once followed Wehrmacht units into occupied territory, lined up on American soil for the final roll call of captivity. This time, the command was not to march into barracks, but to board transport convoys bound for ports like New York and Boston. There, hulking passenger liners converted for prisoner exchange awaited them. Among the most notable was the SS Gripsholm, a ship already infamous for its role in ferrying prisoners and civilians across wartime seas under neutral Swedish colors. For many women, stepping toward the gangplank was not triumph but dread. Captivity had been paradoxical, humiliating, yet safe. They had eaten daily meals of bread and beans while their families starved under rationing. They had washed in hot water, used soap without fear, and written in diaries that spoke of survival, without bombs overhead. Now, as they prepared to leave, those comforts weighed heavily. One diary entry confessed, "What will they say when they learn we lived in comfort? That we grew healthy while they wasted away." On the docks, the departure scenes carried their own contradictions. U.S. Army guards, some of whom had supervised the women for over a year, raised their hands in salute, a gesture of military respect for those who had once been enemy. The women, uncertain how to respond, offered awkward bows or stiff nods. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the quiet shuffle of boots on wooden planks and the hum of ship engines stirring to life. As the vessel slipped out of harbor, the women pressed themselves against railings, watching the American coast recede. For some, relief swelled. The long captivity was finally ending. For others, fear took hold. Ahead lay a homeland in ruins, its cities flattened by Allied bombers, its people grappling with hunger and humiliation, its future uncertain. Letters received through the Red Cross had already prepared them for fragments of this reality. Homes destroyed in Dresden, families displaced from Königsberg, brothers lost in the Soviet camps. Still, hearing about devastation and returning to it were different burdens. A nurse scribbled into her notebook during the crossing, "I left Germany broken, but I returned more afraid, not of the Americans, but of my own people." On-board routines mirrored the discipline of captivity. Meals were rationed, bunks assigned, medical checks conducted. Yet beneath the order lay silence. Women gathered in clusters, some whispering about what awaited them, others staring at the sea for hours. Chocolate wrappers, remnants of Red Cross parcels, drifted on the deck like guilty secrets. When the ships reached German ports, Bremerhaven, Hamburg, Lübeck, the silence broke. Repatriated prisoners disembarked to scenes of desolation. Families embraced, but questions lingered. How had they survived so well while others had not? Their fuller faces, healthier skin, and stronger frames betrayed a paradox that could not be easily explained. Survival had carried them across the ocean, but it also marked them as different. Some women faced suspicion. Neighbors whispered that captivity in America must have softened their loyalties. Others buried their experiences in silence, choosing never to speak of the bread, the soap, the paradox of kindness from the enemy. For them, reintegration meant not recounting the truth, but erasing it, weaving back into a society too scarred to hear such contradictions. Yet the memory of those final salutes and awkward bows lingered. Captivity had eroded more than freedom. It had eroded certainty itself. And as these women walked again on German soil, they carried the invisible weight of a question that could not be set down. Had they returned home as survivors or as strangers? The paradox of captivity followed them ashore, and with whispers of rebuilding around them, they realized a new war had begun, not of armies, but of memory and silence. The story of German women behind American barbed wire closed not with gunfire or liberation parades, but with silence. In that silence lingered a question that none of them could answer easily. Had captivity been a punishment, or had it been a kind of refuge? Soap, the most ordinary of objects, carried this paradox to the end. On the day of their arrival, many had recoiled from it, whispering in dread that the white bars handed to them at Fort Devens might be laced with poison. A year later, the same soap rested by their bunks as part of routine, the small comfort of cleanliness, a ritual that offered dignity in the face of powerlessness. For some, it was a mark of survival, proof that even in defeat their humanity had not been stripped away. For others, it was a reminder of dependence, a silent symbol that their enemy had given them more than their own homeland could. Post-war testimonies captured this unease. In interviews conducted years later, German nurses and clerks admitted quietly, sometimes shamefully, that American camps had felt like paradise on earth. Not because they were treated with luxury. There were no feather beds, no banquets, no freedom, but because they had food, order, and protection at a time when their families in Dresden or Hamburg lived amid bomb craters and starvation. Bread was rationed but steady, meat appeared occasionally, and chocolate from Red Cross parcels turned up like a miracle. In captivity, there was predictability, a strange form of safety that many found more humane than the chaos waiting in the Reich. Yet with that gratitude came shame. How could one speak of eating well while neighbors back home scavenged for potato peels in ruins? How could a former Red Cross aide describe washing with hot water while her mother queued for hours in the cold to fetch a single bucket? Silence became its own prison. As women buried their memories, unable to share them without betraying those who had suffered more, diaries that survived tell the story with more honesty than their voices ever could. One German secretary wrote, "Behind barbed wire, I was fed, I was clean, I was alive. I returned home and wished I had been hungrier, dirtier, more wretched, so that I might belong again." The contradiction lingered for decades, a haunting reminder that war's wounds are not cut only by cruelty. Sometimes they are cut by kindness from the enemy, kindness that unsettled identity, eroded certainty, and left scars as deep as violence. In the end, the memory of captivity distilled into images. The clang of a mess tin filled with beans and bread, the stiff salute of an American guard at departure, the faint sweetness of chocolate on the tongue. And always, the bar of soap, once an object of terror, later a tool of survival, finally a symbol too complex to name. The story closes where it began, in a barracks gone quiet. A wooden shelf sits against a wall, a single bar of soap resting untouched. Morning light filters through the slats of the window, and a wisp of steam curls upward from the washroom. It is an image of survival, of paradox, of memory that will not fade, paradise or prison. The truth lies somewhere between, carried forever in the silence of those who lived it.